Okay, we are now recording. With me, I have Jeremiah O'Driscoll. Thank you so much for joining me for a conversation about movies and how they're made and a perspective that people don't really get, about some of their favorite movies. Because as we all know, you've been behind some of the greatest movies that are tattooed in our brains.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to talk to you, and I like to be of help. So,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the reason why I sort of do this is because, I mean, as a film geek, we all love the DVD extras that come with movies, and I figure, well, that's such in-depth conversation you only get when someone's talking for an hour watching a movie. Why not just do a whole series like that? I mean, we live in sort of the
right.
digital age anyway, so I'm glad you're here, and hopefully we're gonna unlock some secrets, and it won't be like Al Capone's chest.
Oh no, I got some goodies in there.
Awesome. Awesome. I mean, one of the reasons I'm excited to talk to you is because, cinema obviously has undergone some huge changes within the last, I would say, 10 to 20 years. Since I would say about 2000, 2005, it's when it really started, the transition into the digital age. And people always talk about digital cameras and the influence that it's had on how movies are made. Because in the days of film, you have to really set up the shot, especially, people starting off lower budget movies, no budget movies. We hear the stories about Kevin Smith and Robert Rodriguez. When you're shooting a movie, like that, and you're shooting it on film, pretty much every shot has to be these shots. So pre-production is king. In the digital age, there's not as much risk behind the shot anymore, and it's sort of changing how movies are made. So, you know, coming from someone who came from a world of editing on film in that world, and now where everything has sort of transitioned into the digital world, how would you say it's really affected the way movies are made?
Well, it's interesting, and it is something that even predates my work in the movies. As I was a teenager, I was a painter. I moved from painting into photography, and eventually I would do landscapes with a view camera where you go under the hood. And when you learn to do that, you realize the frame is the frame.
Hmm.
You don't shoot a thing and then crop it later, anything like that. You want to use the whole negative. So same, of course, with painting, because you're not going to chop it up later and put it on a smaller thing. But so at any rate, and part of my interest in movies was, the frustration with still photography, and I just wanted to see things move. And when I tried it, as a teenager, it was really difficult for me. I just couldn't get it, and I loved that about it because it was something beyond my capabilities, definitely. So that really intrigued me about it. Now I think the thing, and this, I think this speaks to several of the things that you were saying, is that to me, the important thing is when you make a shot, whether it's working your camera, working
Hmm.
with your actors, the camera movement, when I'm in the cutting room and I'm looking for that piece, what I'm looking for is that every moment of the shot is a commitment. It's not now, not to say there are some movies where, say, documentary, where you just happen to catch the thing and they go, oh, that's gold right there. But to me, and it's not, it's everything, like to me, every cut is a commitment too. It's
Hmm.
not something where you go, oh, well, sometimes I do. I'll say, oh, Bob, Bob Zemeckis,
Hmm.
since I happen to be in his cutting room more often than not, I would say, okay, I'm just going to do this in a sloppy way, and I'll fix it. I'll
Hmm.
fix it right away if we're in the zone. But there's a certain commitment to where every cut is, and it's the same with that. Now, I don't, of course, that's one kind of a film,
Hmm.
that's one kind of a film that comes out of a long tradition,
Hmm.
that not to say there aren't fantastically wonderful news ways of making a movie and catching things with multiple cameras and
Mhm.
creating something brilliant out of it.
Yeah, I
But
like how you said that y- every shot, every cut you make is a commitment because uh, you came from the school of, sitting behind the moviola where if you wanted to test out a cut, if you wanted to see what it would look like, it was a commitment of time to sort of get that all
yeah,
ready to watch it. Whereas now, if you're editing, you can get five different versions of a scene in a matter of 20 minutes just by laying it out in the different timelines.
yeah.
So it's definitely changing the way the next generation and the next generation after that of editors, how they sort of go about experimenting with the scene. So I mean, you obviously have to do a lot of cutting in your mind, whereas now I feel it might be a muscle that's not being worked out as much. Do you feel it's gonna have maybe a negative impact, or do you feel
Oh,
it'll sort of balance itself out?
I mean, when I see a movie where I can tell it's made, with that same sort of criteria or whatever, if the camera's the filmmaker's paintbrush,
Hmm.
then I can definitely love that kind of movie. But I don't know. I'm excited to see what comes,
Yeah,
what is the new generation of all this stuff,
yeah,
and new and different ways of telling stories and because I do think the human mind is evolving very
yeah.
quickly, and so I say it only in regards to you know my my experience.
So we were
Uh,
talking about sort of nonlinear editing in digital platforms, and I always find it super interesting that there's this whole battle to save film, which I'm on the side of it. I feel film, besides just looking different, the there's a responsibility to it. Like I said, there's the importance of the shot. I don't really see anyone fighting to save the moviola. I think pretty much everyone's happy
uh,
with nonlinear editing platforms.
well, I do think having learned on a moviola and 16 millimeter on a moviola
Hmm.
and undergraduate at NYU in the early 80s, it was reversal stock at first. So if you ripped up that shot going through the gate, you're going to go to your second. You better have a second best shot that you can cut with. But the thing that was brilliant about a moviola, and this is too is going to be some old timer talk, right? Is just that it was really a craft. It was a machine with a foot pedal and a handbrake, and you got the rhythm of it down, and that really there's something to the rhythm of everything that you did on a moviola that just somehow it was just very satisfying, and it was a physical thing. Often, I mean, working in the cutting room used to be an incredibly physical endeavor.
Hmm.
You were always winding through film as an assistant or an apprentice. You always had the film in your hands, ideally not too much so, um, but the physical aspects of it certainly have evaporated completely. But which is probably again a fine thing because it's lovely to go to a preview carrying a drive that you could fit
Hmm.
in your pocket
Yeah.
instead of 16 Goldbergs.
Yeah, it does take a lot of risk out of that stuff. Although
Sure
it
does.
doesn't have the same smell as film stock. That
Oh,
that
well,
is
see, I
something
don't
that's,
miss
yeah.
that, and I don't
Really?
miss the
That sort of cheese,
acme.
that bad
Oh,
cheese smell
oh man,
every time you
this
open a roll.
my first job in a cutting room was working in Acme, which is this, oh man, it was Dickensian. It was a thing that would, with heat and graphite and oil, it would burn a code onto every foot of your film in your track so you could locate it afterwards, when you
Hmm.
were recutting and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't miss that one at all. But anyway.
Yeah, Peter Billingsley, who's an executive producer, he was behind The Breakup and Iron Man. there was an old episode of a show that I love, Dinner for Five, where he's talking about how when he was transitioning from an actor, he was actually part of a Christmas
Yeah,
Story, also a very famous
Ralphie. You
Christmas
gotta
movie.
listen to
Yeah,
Ralphie.
yeah, the tradition that you sort of continued with the Polar Express. So when he was transitioning to sort of working behind the camera, he asked Bob Clark, who was the director of that movie, for some advice, and he said, if you want to learn how to make movies, you have to live in the editing suite because that's really where you learn how to make movies. And it's such a different editing suite, that I'm
Yes.
guessing from then to now. So I'm curious, what is it that could have sort of been learned then in an editing suite as opposed to now with the style of cutting?
Well, this goes to another thing that's quite important to me, which is, I mean, I was for a long time I was an assistant, and if people look up my credits, you'll see a lot of the movies you're going to talk about I was an assistant on, not an editor, or I was an associate editor, I was something else, a sound editor, whatever it was. So I tend to use them a bit interchanging them. But so I let's see. I guess the thing was, like, why I'm here right now was I did a show for free. This is, well, we don't need to talk about that,
Hmm.
for a producer. And then 2 years later, he called me back and said, I'm doing this movie called Last of the Mohicans, and I'd love for you to be on it, because he remembered that I worked for him for
Hmm.
free. So I was thrust into a cutting room in North Carolina on location, and the editor had someone else in mind, someone he wanted to bring from California to have my apprentice position. So he was kind of very suspicious of me, but over the months and years that it took, I kind of won his trust pretty quickly. And then what happened was you'd take notes when the director's time is so limited, especially while you're shooting, especially when you're on location, et cetera, et cetera. So there would always be someone in the room taking the notes for the editor and the director. He'd say, "Oh, let me make sure to go back if we still have that set and get some more coverage here," or man, I really wish I had done that reverse and I didn't do it, and I'm going to kick myself, but maybe we can do it as a set piece at the end of the day if we have a, yeah, all these
Yeah.
things. So there you really began to hear, because the director and the editor would start to articulate what it was. Now the thing is this, and this is, it's going to sound, I don't know how best to say it, but a lot of time as an editor, you have to put something in front of your director that they don't like, and it's not what they want, but you have to to go through the discipline, because a lot of time, even though a director has this inspiration or reads a script or writes a script or whatever, sometimes what he shoots is exactly that. Sometimes it's quite different than that. But as you know, it in the end, it may become a completely different beast, or it may be exactly what he intended. But for someone to articulate it now that they're looking at it, it's always easier to criticize what you don't like. So it's a long process of putting things in front of a person which they don't
Yeah.
like, and then they start to tell you why they don't like it. And maybe he'll say, well, you intercut this conversation. I thought I'd just leave it in the master, because what she does when he's talking is just so great. And you kind of, you can see the chemistry and the physicality between the two of them.
Hmm.
So they start to articulate this thing, and they do it more and more, and then you really get in sync with them, ideally in sync with the movie and in sync with them, and what that original inspiration was. And then late in the game, when you're about to push it out the door, you generally say, hey, so how does this relate to that thing, that you first saw in your
Hmm.
head or whatever? And sometimes that can be a very interesting answer. But anyway,
Well, it
so
sounds a
that,
lot like therapy, like cinema therapy, figuring out, what's
yeah.
the Sigmund Freud id of the movie.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of movies, a lot of movies, you have to find what's in there because all over again, it isn't not quite like throwing out the script,
Mhm.
because I would never do that. And a lot of times when you get with a director and you put the whole thing together and then you get little over crazy and you cut a bunch of stuff out, and then you show it to some friends or an audience or something like that, and you go, you know what, we really needed that scene, and I didn't see it at the time, but now because the thing about the script is nothing got there on accident. It all is very intentional,
Yeah.
whether it's subconscious or completely on a technical level. So it's interesting. Now, in the end product, yeah, you might lift that scene entirely because you realize, well, no, you don't need it. But so it's living with the thing, and the movie. Sometimes the movie is a very different movie than you think it is. Not well, sometimes in a ghastly way, but I haven't had too many of those. Like, I've been very lucky not to have so many of those. But yeah, you just have to let the film play for you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole process. You mentioned screenwriting. There's so many processes that go into making a movie, sometimes parallel, sometimes in a row. And with writing a script, it's sort of, it could be its own sort of novel because it is a complete, concise story. And like you said, everything is written for a reason.
yeah,
And then when you get to set, sometimes there might be that urge to be Jean-Luc Godard and say, well, let's just do a different movie altogether.
right,
So it's definitely a tricky tightrope to walk. I mean,
yeah.
obviously, when you're working with a lot of talented people, I'm sure there's sort of that safety net where, this isn't anyone's first rodeo. So what we're gonna get at the end of the day is probably at the very least gonna be well crafted.
Yeah, you're always looking for that bit of that little spark, and when you
Hmm.
see it, you just have to hold on to it and not mess it up, because like when a movie that was really meaningful in the overall body of my career, a real paradigm shift was Cutting Flight. And when I it was complicated for a lot of reasons to figure out how to preserve Denzel's performances
Hmm.
for various reasons. But in looking at dailies and cutting about a month into cutting the movie, shooting the movie and cutting it, I saw these dailies of this scene where he wakes up in the hospital the more, after the crash. And I just saw this take, and Denzel was just amazing, just amazing. And you just go, that's it. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is recognize that spark of brilliance when you see it. And then you try your best not to mess it up by a bunch of cutting or whatever.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how so much of filmmaking is so simple, where it's just, does that look like a movie? Does that
Yeah,
look like the movies that I watch? I mean, it's
right.
complicated because, it's not that easy to make something look like a good movie, but ultimately you're just asking yourself, does that look like a movie? And you mentioned Flight. I love John Goodman in that movie as pretty much anything that he's in. And it's those
Right.
sort of characters, the supporting roles, where it's these characters that I feel come into a movie and give it that life
Yeah.
and the choice of when and how to introduce that sort of personality. I'm always fascinated by.
Right, right. Well, yeah, Mr. Zemeckis is pretty fantastic when it comes to comings and goings and introducing characters, especially when you have John Goodman.
Yeah, just a ponytailed head popping in through the peephole. Hey, are you
Right.
guys ready
Too,
for
it,
me yet?
it, it felt like the part he was always waiting to play,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh,
his
I love it when he
prime.
comes in there with the briefcase. He has the
Yeah,
cure for the
yeah.
for the solution. That was totally. I was not expecting that, and for
Oh,
such an intense scene that was
yeah.
happening in the movie, when that happened, I'm like, I love when there's such a blend of humor and drama,
Yeah.
and that just worked so well for the movie.
Yeah. Too, there's an interesting thing. I mean, I don't know. This is may not be totally on topic or whatever, but there's a thing about when in the midst of this wreck, where he tells Margaret the what do you call it? Air, the stewardess,
Mhm.
to say you love her, you love your son, tell him on the recording, And I think it's interesting. It's interesting that Gatens wrote that because it kind of changes everything that happens after it. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's one of those moments. It reminds me of another movie, Signs, where Mel Gibson's character at the end, the way he sort of handles himself, and Joaquin Phoenix is his brother, starts telling him, "There's a look that I saw in your eyes, and I never want to see it again." And it's sort of
Yeah,
like at that moment, Denzel Washington's character, there's sort of an understanding that he has not just about that situation, but
right.
life in general. That's very, very intense. And
Yeah,
like you said, everything that moves forward from that movie, where it's if that situation hadn't happened, if the plane didn't crash, if he didn't have to do what he did, it landed normally and everything went on, he's still that same person in his mind. This is just a
right,
situation that sort of brought a spotlight to it.
right.
And I mean, obviously, because it happened, we have a movie to watch. Otherwise, it would have been a much shorter film. But
Mhm.
it's definitely makes you think. I think the best movies make you think about yourself a little bit, and what kind of
Right.
person you want to be, and question what kind of person you think you are or actually are. And
Yeah.
that's one of those things where, through this fictional character, we have the opportunity to sort of
Right.
look at our real selves and then get a little neurotic about it. That's what movies are,
Right.
that's what movies are about.
Right.
And, we were talking about the changing in technology, but also visual technology changed, where, you know, and the movies you worked on, working with Mr. Zemeckis, there was uh, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Forrest Gump, Death Becomes Her. We're sort of starting to take, visual digital technology and use it in genres that it wasn't really being used at the time. People would expect something in, say, a movie like Jurassic Park, but CGI being used in a a 2 hour, 2.5 hour drama that follows the life of someone from Alabama around the world, it
Right.
really was, is this going to work? Are they going to laugh at us for doing this? And now it's sort
Yeah.
of standard protocol with movies. So the fact that you worked on that stuff and now it's standard is fascinating. And you did it again. You did it with the Polar
Oh
Express,
well.
with Beowulf, with the motion capture, and again there were sort of those same conversations. Well, what is this? Is this necessary?
Right.
Is this going to work? And the fact of the matter is now we're seeing it in so many movies. Uh, but my question is, when you're working on something like that, when you're working on a movie that's totally motion capture, and obviously it's being used for a reason. With the Polar Express, we were talking
Mhm.
earlier, I said to me the movie truly feels like a dream. I also said because of it, I want to see Eyes Wide Shut in motion capture, but that's just my own weird mind when it comes to movies. Uh,
Uh,
so it changes entirely the feeling of the movie, the way the performances come off. What There was some criticism of it at the time, but there's always criticism when something new comes along. People are afraid. It happened with James Cameron and Avatar and the whole 3D revolution.
right.
But from
Mhm.
your perspective, before any of that even happened, just sitting behind the editing desk,
Mhm.
looking at the footage of a movie that looks totally different than anything you've ever cut before, how do you
Yeah.
go about cutting something like that? Do you have to sort of retrain your mind in how you watch footage, do your shot selection?
Well, I mean, there's a technical thing that hopefully this won't be too boring, but the way we made Polar Express, Beowulf, and Christmas Carol, there were no actual film. There were no cameras. There was no camera work being done on set.
Mhm.
Everything was in a black box theater, and the only thing we had were the dots moving in space in 3 dimensions in the computer, and then we had about 25 to 35 witness cameras around. Sometimes you'd have an operator, train on a close up of, say, Tom Hanks, um, either as the boy playing the part of the boy, playing Santa, playing whomever he was in that scene. Um, and so I could see the performance. There was a little, especially with Polar Express, all the shots you see in the movie were done in post in a computer. But we still wanted it to have a very handheld, not a handheld, but a crafted look to it.
Hmm.
So you won't see a perfectly keyframed pan with anything. All of this was intentionally done so that you felt like, like an example of that is when they get to the square at the end, and the Zeppelin has knocked the star off of the top of the thing, and it comes falling down at the camera. You'll see the camera work is not perfect, but it does give that human touch, which was very important to Zemeckis, to not make it look perfect, but to make it look human.
Hmm.
As far as the way the camera was being operated, and so there was, especially with Polar, because you have so many scenes where it's Tom Hanks in one scale playing against Tom Hanks in another scale, say when the kid runs out Tom Hanks to see the train the first time, and Tom Hanks, the conductor, steps out, and then they walk to meet each other. You have to do a lot of math.
It,
Because
it
yeah, and you
it's
have to,
totally new type of filmmaking.
yeah, and you'd have to, in a way, you'd have to cut the scene in your head, because both of those actors are screen hogs on occasion, and they
Hmm.
might do a reaction a bit longer, and nobody wanted to play to their own playback
Hmm.
as the other character. So there was a lot of the first couple of weeks on Polar Express. It was just, you wondered how we were ever going to make a movie out of all of this stuff. I mean, you know, it was crazy. People, even some of the biggest directors, would come and visit us once we got a rhythm going, and we went, okay, well, I think this is the next step we have to do, and they would
Well, it's an
just leave.
experiment, so everyone
Yes.
wants to sort of see. There's that curiosity.
Uh, and everyone would leave with a migraine. But
Yeah. Well, it's
they go,
funny
where?
you mentioned the way it was done because in my mind, it did feel the way it looked that it was traditional filmmaking. To me, the movie that I compared it to while watching it was, and it's probably going to sound surprising, but A Scanner Darkly by Richard Linklater,
Mhm.
which was rotoscoped. And that's how it felt to me. It felt like a movie that was filmed traditionally, and then the whole thing was just gone over with sort of, a 3D brush.
Yeah,
But the way you describe it is a totally different sort of filmmaking, and it seems
yeah.
like entirely you still have to be rooted in such film theory and technique not to sort of get lost in that ocean.
Absolutely. I mean, when when you're in the square at the end and the boy is sitting on Santa's lap, I think you have a shot with 5 Tom Hanks performances in it,
Hmm.
because I think there's one that also has the hobo that's Hanks.
Hmm.
So you see, I mean, just everyone on the screen is Hanks except for, some of the elves. So I mean, it's just
Yeah, it's very
craziness.
dreamlike, and
Yeah.
obviously, I think that's why the movie works and the whole point of the movie, and maybe why it took so long for it to get made. Because sometimes, that movie, I don't think it would have worked just showing it. Uh, if it
Right.
was done in 1975 with
Right.
an anamorphic lens, I don't think it would have been the same kind of movie as it is like this. And I actually forced my son's about to be 2. It was just the holiday season. I forced him to watch it way more than even he wanted to, just because I just kept getting into it more and more.
Yeah.
And once a movie like that lands and it has that staying power, now the experiment is, well, where else can we use that and make it work? Maybe an
Right.
Eyes Wide Shut in the future,
Right.
and that's what I love about these movies, and you get to see it from the front lines of, well, this is the start. What's it going to sprout up into?
Right, right. And there's, many that can go in many different directions. One thing that I hadn't thought of, but of course, studios and visual effects companies did was buying the digital rights to various actors and only exercising the right after the person passes away.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
technically,
that's a little eerie.
yes, it definitely was. As far as I know, it's never happened because,
No, I saw the
just,
movie on that. What was it? The Matrix? I think that's sort of what's happening to everyone.
yeah.
And
But yeah, so I mean, there was a lot of stuff, but that was the thing, especially Zemeckis was looking for is the movies that you couldn't do previously, the way they were written or the way they had fantastical elements where you just couldn't do it. I mean, of course, he could have done Beowulf, I guess, with some sort of, you know, but it has a sort of visceral quality, when you get in there. I haven't seen that one in a long time, but
yeah, but no matter what, when the movie is made, it's sort of it exists. So when you watch Beowulf, whoever then wants to go use that technique in the future, whether they like the movie or not, everyone has their own opinion of movies they watch. They still are forced to watch it and learn from it because there's not that many options of the
right.
movies made that way. Someone has to be the first person to go out there. Raoul
Yeah.
Walsh making sort of the first anamorphic widescreen movie, it didn't really land that well, even though it had John Wayne in it, The Big
Sure.
Trail. But, someone had to make it first. Someone had to make the first sound movie so
Yeah.
that everyone else can then look and say, okay, well, I like that. I didn't like that. Let's do that a little differently. And it's a
Right.
seed. So,
Right.
one day every movie's going to be sort of done like this, and then everyone's going to complain, well, we don't want this. We want something else. That's when we go back
Yeah.
to the movieola.
Yeah. Oh well, I don't know about that. They all got turned into planters, I hear.
Oh, yeah.
you know, you'd hear about, oh, they're almost stacked in the hallway back there in storage, gathering dust. And I'm
It is
like,
the
oh.
nostalgia generation, though, right?
I don't know. The movie is kind of like, it might be history. But
When
oh
when
well.
you're editing a movie, it's a
Uh,
long process. It's sort of like someone's writing a screenplay. At what point are they like, okay, this is this is ready to be filmed? At what point when you're cutting a movie do you feel, okay, this looks like a movie to me? This looks like something I could imagine seeing on the big screen.
Well, every movie is different. I remember as when I was first assistant on the Birdcage with Mike Nichols
Mhm.
directing, and every day in dailies you'd watch that hour of footage, and you just go like, "That's it, that's it. You guys got the scene, you nailed it." And every day was the same day, and you're just going, "When is our luck going to run out?" And our luck didn't run out. It was a really great combination of people and everyone, and of course Mike Nichols at the head of everything, who I do feel like, and when I talk to younger filmmakers, I'm always thinking, Mike, of course he was super brilliant with everything he did, but it's very, I think there's a lot in his first three, four, or five movies, even the ones that people didn't really click with, like Catch 22,
Mhm.
which I think is an absolutely
Oh,
beautiful
it's
movie.
hilarious. Yeah.
And of course, the thing, like, I'm always trying to get people to realize conflict is the most necessary thing in entertainment, whether it's funny conflict or it's horrible conflict
Mhm.
or whatever. And I went back more recently to look at Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf again, and it just roars off the screen.
Mhm. Yeah,
It's
the
just
acting.
nonstop.
I'm just
And
always fascinated by any movie that's sort of based on a play where it takes place in this sort of one setting, because that's not cinema. Cinema is about the cut and the telling the sort of epic story. So to be able to transform something that inherently isn't cinematic into a
yeah,
cinematic experience, I'm just blown away. Same with like 12 Angry Men.
right,
It's the
yeah,
fact that you're taking this and using the tools of the tray to turn it into an entirely different experience. I
right.
feel if you can make a movie like Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, you can make any movie.
Well, I think so. I think so because it's all that, all everything goes into that. that's why having no limitations can be, I think, a really difficult burden.
Hmm.
I and in all the things I assisted on or edited, there are very few things. I mean, there are those movies where, especially in older days, you would just throw money at the problem, and yes, you get something, that people might want to watch or not at the end. But I never really resented doing a bunch of work because we couldn't afford something. Instead, we found a way to do it, and it actually turned out better in a
Hmm.
weird way because everyone got creative.
Hmm.
I mean, there'd be times where, the director would say, well, I had this crazy idea driving into work today. And we'd all go like, okay, how are we going to do that? And then, generally the video assist guy would say, oh, I see how we do it. We do it this way, because I mean, look, I wasn't there for Back to the Future. That was before my time with Bob. But that first Back to the Future, it only has like 20 something effect shots in it.
Hmm.
Most stuff is practical. And they weren't painting out wires either because
Hmm.
that wasn't a technology that
Hmm.
existed at the time. So they created their own technology. So it's interesting because, too, there's something about the veracity of this stuff that is not digitally manipulated,
Hmm.
where you just go like, see, I think what happens, and this is just me, going on and on about it, but like when I see a movie where someone can fly away from a conflict, I go, well, why didn't that happen earlier and I didn't have to sit through all that cutting? you know, I mean, I know that's anticlimactic, but
Someone
I
didn't
do.
get the memo.
Well, no, but it's sort of like, what's the point? What's the point if
Yeah.
there's not, you know,
Well, there's no danger to it because we as the audience, we're human beings, so we know our own limitations. So when you see someone fly away from something, you think, well, so he's pretty much invincible to that, as opposed to when you're watching someone actually. I always think it's horribly tragic, but on THX 1138, where someone passed away during a stunt on a motorcycle,
right,
obviously you never want that extreme, but there is that real sort of danger, and the audience can relate. You're seeing
yeah,
someone, the first Gone in 60 Seconds, where there's like a list of how many injuries were sustained making
oh,
that
sure,
movie. Yeah, and when you're watching that movie, you're like, wow, that guy's really in that car, jumping over that ramp. It's sort of, I mean, it's like the original Jackass, where people get to watch and be like, no, that's pretty cool. I mean,
yeah,
obviously, there's pluses and minuses, but just speaking strictly from how the audience reacts and how it resonates, I definitely agree with you where CGI and all that stuff, it's a powerful tool, but let's not forget, we're still humans. Let's tap into our own fears, which was
right,
Hitchcock's bread and butter. What sort of makes us uncomfortable. It could
right.
be a human flying away from an explosion, or it could be you're sitting in a small room or on a train with someone who's really creepy, which could have far more of an impact, especially someone in New York who rides the subway every day.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think too, this is skipping back, a
Mhm.
few. So the thing was, when I'd be in the room with Artie Schmidt and with either Michael Mann or Bob Zemeckis or Mike Nichols, it was you got to experience how it all happens. And occasionally, they might turn to you and say, well, what do you think? And that didn't happen too often back in those days, but when it did, you would usually say something totally fumbling and idiotic until until you got a bit more used to it, and you say, well, I don't see why we don't just do this.
Mhm.
They say, well, let's try it, And
Yeah.
anyway, so there was this thing. Nowadays, and I of course can't do anything without assistance. Many of them, I technically am completely inept. All I can do is click a mouse. Um, but my assistants aren't in the room with me when we're making those choices per se. It's really much more like they would come in and sit on the couch and the director's giving me notes, and then they go back and do the tons of other work they have to
Hmm.
do. With Artie, like on Forrest Gump, that was the last movie we cut on film. And that was a complicated one on film because there were almost always 6, 7, 8 tracks running at the same time, because it's a lot of movies, and that is perhaps about one of your other questions, which is, what can be done better nowadays. That's great because of course you can run 30
Hmm.
whatever tracks if
Yeah.
you want to, but in those days it was a mechanical thing and it was a lot of work. So but when the director would leave and we'd start working on the notes, I would Artie would go to work here. I would silently go to the take. I knew which take it was, what box it was in. Went over to the other chem. I loaded it up. I ran it down to the area so he could run backwards and forwards, find the exact frame he
Hmm.
needed. So it was like a really great training, and I can't really hand that down to my assistants in the same way. The sort of unspoken part of it, where you're
Hmm.
serving someone like that, but you're also learning at the same time.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like hearing about the Beatles recording on the first 16 track and what they were able to accomplish with that limited technology. Whereas if you can't make something special with what we have now,
Yeah.
what is the special by pushing today's technology? I have to ask because you run through the gauntlet of sort of the all-time greatest directors who you happen to work with. At some point, you have to sit back and say, because all these people want to work with me, I have to be pretty good at what I do.
No way. No. It's weird. You don't really think about it that often.
Mhm.
The past 3 years or so, I've done 2 shows in London, and over there, a lot of people. It's interesting. It's quite different. It's very lively. The community in and around London. You run into people on in Soho on the street, and there's a lot of young filmmakers. There's a lot of film festivals. There's a lot of talent. There's talent everywhere, and you see it on the street. You see it in the theaters. Young people directing these great plays, and then they're you say that I thought that was a fantastically well done play, and they go, oh yeah, but I want to make this movie, and go, well, I do know a thing or two about that, not how to direct, but I know
Mhm.
how to.
Yeah.
So socially it was very interesting, and people once or twice would go like, well, can we interview you? And you don't, you know especially editors, I don't think you ever really think about this stuff because you're too busy focusing on what's exactly in front of you. And so it's interesting to go back through all these years and go like, well, gosh, I really was there for that. And, was I making that up? No, I wasn't making it up. I remember, I mean, the first thing I did, uh, Orson Welles did the narration to. I mean, it's just like, what in the world?
Yeah, it's sort of like you're living a dream. I mean,
Yeah,
just recently, you
but you
know,
don't even think about it at the time until you start to look backwards a bit.
that, yeah, I mean, I don't know. For me, I mean, I'm at a point right now, as a filmmaker, obviously just starting off and starting to get projects together. And I grew up across the street from like 5 movie theaters, and one of them a famous movie theater on Queens Boulevard. And the movie I just did screened there. So
Oh,
it's definitely an
that's
interesting moment where you're sitting in your childhood movie theater. You watch Jurassic Park, My Cousin Vinny, all these movies, which my mom, I remember I was a little kid. She brought me into there and she asked them, is it appropriate to bring a small child into this movie? And they're like, well, there's a lot of cursing. She's like, but is there any nudity? And they're like, no. She's like, okay, we're good. And
funny.
to have, your name on that screen, it's definitely, I mean, when you're a kid and you think, are you going to be making Oscar nominated, Oscar winning movies? Are you going to be involved in that process? It really is, a big accomplishment at some point. you have to reflect that you're a part of so many people's lives watching these movies.
Yeah, yeah, I started in such low budget stuff that I made a habit of never going to see my own work on the big screen because because a lot of times I was making the kind of movie I wouldn't enjoy seeing anyway, and I was too busy. You just get so. It's interesting if you work really hard and keep your nose to the grindstone, and people can get along with you and they can find they can trust you,
Hmm.
then you generally get a lot of work very quickly in the business. And so I was just too busy. So consequently, the first movie that I worked on that I saw in the movie theater was Driving Miss Daisy, where I was the location apprentice
Hmm.
editor. And we all knew that movie would be special from before. The first time we heard it was going to come to Atlanta and shoot there, we went, that's the one. And there are just so many great memories from it. And then I wasn't there for post because the editor, Mark Werner, who's absolutely brilliant, he never came out to the location, Atlanta. I just kept shipping the movie back to Los Angeles where he was working. And then I went on to other movies, and eventually a few months later, the movie came out. So I went to see it, and they had moved our names, the apprentice editors and the editors, way up in the end crawl. So we were like right after the assistant directors. And I just thought, occasionally a producer or a studio will do that for you if they feel
Hmm.
like you really bent over backwards or something. But I don't know, it's something that was the first time I saw my name on the screen, and I just loved that movie.
Mm, yeah, and nonchalantly bring a date to it, just sitting there. Let's stick through the credits. Oh, look at
I
that right
forgot.
there. Oh, that's what I did 3 months ago.
I think I was with my parents just
That's
to
even
get
better. I told you I could do this.
dork
You're
factor.
wrong.
Oh man. No, but yeah, so you do kind of go like, I mean, what you love is late in the process of finishing up the Birdcage. Mike Nichols would send me to all around to screen it for people. So I screened it for Sondheim. I flew here with a print of the film. For John Calley to see it, Robin Williams. Anyway, but especially the screenings where there was a crowd,
Hmm.
you would go in, you check the film, you make tech do a tech check and make sure everything was fine. And sometimes you'd wait for the first 15 minutes and then you'd go eat lunch or something because you just got off the plane. And then I'd go back about 15 minutes before it was over, and I'd just stand outside that door and listening to all these people laugh hilariously. And I would go, what a gift for $7 at that point. What a
Yeah.
gift to just totally you and because a lot of times most of my career I felt guilty, that I was doing nothing of value for the world. But then I realized that these things do have an impact on people, and sometimes it's a very important
Hmm.
impact. So
Hey, we're still talking about Mozart, so there's definitely importance to culture, and even lowbrow culture is still culture. I mean, not that you're a part of that. Obviously, the movies you're working
oh,
on
that's one of
are
those.
are what is it, Alan
I do
Smithy?
every
That's the
brow. I've done every brow.
yeah. And I love your sort of philosophy and great lesson on how to succeed without really trying. Just don't annoy anyone. I wonder if they teach that at NYU yet for
uh
for
yeah.
sophomore students. Don't annoy the director 101.
That might have been. Well, let me think back. Of course, that was the '80s, so it doesn't count anymore. They've got a lot more money now than back in those days.
Yeah, I mean, just talking about it, I love talking to anyone who just has a passion for movies. Where we talked about where the technology was, where the technology is. There's, I mean, I personally believe movie theaters are very important. I just did a piece with Todd Strauss-Schulson. He has a movie coming out, Isn't It Romantic? So he's also from Forest Hills, my neighborhood. So I figured I have a movie coming out. He obviously has a huge movie coming out in February. let's go back and take a look at the movie theaters we grew up going to, because there's only about one left. The rest of them are like a Duane Reade and a Gap.
Oh,
So we
sure.
walked to all
Sure.
these locations, and while it was very bittersweet because
Yeah.
you think about your own memories, and then you start remembering how different it is watching a movie with 100 other people.
Yeah.
Good, bad. It's totally different. And you don't have the freedom to 5 minutes into a movie be in your cell phone. You sort of have to reinvest into the movie.
Sure.
And now with Netflix, who I love because I feel they're giving people opportunities, but it is a
Absolutely.
totally different style,
Right.
of how people are watching the movies. I feel right now it's almost, a movie is considered great if you enjoyed while on your phone. That's sort of the culture we have now, and I'm guilty of it also. It's just the technology is there. It's too easy.
Mhm.
Where do you see everything going?
Oh, well, gosh. I mean, there was a time when we were close to finishing The Walk, in 3D, on IMAX that, you know, we were watching one of the scenes at the end, Mr. Zemeckis said, "Ah, this'll look great on an iPhone."
Yeah, every time I
I
hear they're like, "Oh, there's a new 8K camera coming out," I'm like, "So how
Yeah.
much smaller is the phone gonna get that's gonna play it?"
Mhm. Well, another thing I love is you can actually shoot night now. You could never shoot night before, I
Y-
remember even when we started Polar Express, I think I was the only person out of the crew of 400 people who had ever actually seen the Northern Lights. So half of the time working on the movie, I was describing it to them. No, it's not like that. It's sort of like this,
Who has a
But
pen and paper? Who has a pen and paper?
now you got brilliant footage on YouTube, you go like, "Oh my gosh, look at that, it's right there." Could never get that, in film, always had to trick it out somehow.
I'm
Anyway,
not going to
but
take up too much of your time. I just going to leave with this last question because we spent so much time talking about the technology, and obviously, there's limitations with working with film stock and editing the old school way. What sort of problems do you feel exist uniquely to digital technology, whether shooting or reviewing footage on set, editing nonlinear? What are sort of new problems that you had after you switched over to digital that you sort of had to relearn the process?
well, you do have to in the old days, you always had, especially if you're an apprentice or an assistant, you basically got to see the footage, every foot of the film twice, once to, check your sync on it very quickly on a flatbed or on a moviola, and then once on the big screen. And in the traditional sense, I never had the pleasure of working with Dee Allen, but I learned a lot
Hmm.
from the people who did. And there's an entire legion of people who learned at Dee Allen's side.
DDL,
But
legendary editor, just for anyone who doesn't know, although I
yeah.
think the audience would be familiar. A
Oh, I
very
think
film
so.
geeky audience, I think we're attracting, and
I,
and I'm
I
very proud of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, she was very adamant that your first responsibility, well, maybe not the first one, but the first one of the biggest ones, is to memorize every foot of film. And especially when we'd run it on a screen, you could actually do that. You could train your mind to remember that. And then 6 months later, when you're in the cutting room, the director would say, "No, use the take where she flubbed the line because she was so great before she flubbed
Mhm.
it," and you go, "Oh, that's take 7. It's in this box here. Let me go get it. It's in a trim bin." And that sort of facility with everything, all of your tools, so to speak, all of your material, that does have a tendency, sadly, to go away because you have such random access. And you would on occasionally, if they were cutting on a flatbed, you'd be rewinding a reel, and the editor or the director say, "Whoa, whoa, 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 what was that? What was that I just saw there?" And go, "Oh, run back to it." And they goes, I completely forgot about that. I really love that when the actor did that. So there was something in that in between zone where nowadays we'd look at it and go, "Well, what's all that wasted time when you have no time to make your movie?" And but schedules and budgets are always getting shoved together because of the money involved. But there was something about that was very, informative. But even I get to the point where I go like, man, I have to really pay attention when you watch the smaller screen. And although the other thing is you would develop an ability to cut for the big screen, even though you're seeing it on a small screen, because even then you'd see it on a small screen, but you just had in your head, you knew that cut would be okay if they played it at the Cinerama Dome, which I don't know. That might have come through all the years as an assistant. I'm not sure, but so there's that about it. And I forget, what was the question again? Sorry about that.
Memorizing shots.
Oh yeah.
Working out memory.
So,
Yeah, I
because
mean,
there's not that much there aren't that many drawbacks to me, with film, but
mhm.
I do miss the commitment of everything, you know.
It seems like it really trains the brain muscle to sort of think in the terms of film language more.
Yeah. To every 10 minutes of film, every 1,000-foot roll that you get in dailies, maybe some movies you get 20 or more of them.
Mhm.
Driving Miss Daisy, you'd only get 2 of them every day because they couldn't afford to shoot anymore. I mean, I talk about the percentage of what they shot to what went in the movie. I synchronized every bit of that film, and man, Beresford only shot what he needed to use. And
Discipline.
yeah, and he was cutting it in his head, I could tell. So anyway, um, so there's that about it. But, so I still have to, crack myself and
Mhm.
say, no, 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 get back in there and look at all this stuff again and make sure you didn't leave any great bits and pieces in there. Um,
Well, and I can tell you that much. I'm very familiar with your work, and it's phenomenal. And
thanks. Thank
and I,
you.
I look forward. I look forward to see what's next and what's coming. And with each new movie, I'm sort of going in there. I want to enjoy a movie because there's something about watching a great movie that says, okay, I'm gonna make movies differently now because I had a chance to watch this movie. There's
Yeah,
something I'm walking away with. I can't go back. I
right.
can't not see the light again after watching
Yeah.
this movie.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. It's been a pleasure
Oh,
chatting with you. I'd love to do it again sometime.
please
Uh,
do. That'd be
yeah,
great.
I mean, I learned a lot. Everyone listening, I'm sure learned a lot, and they're gonna tell their friends, yeah, yeah, that movie I learned a lot, and then they're gonna actually go and watch that movie because
Oh
that's
man.
that's the thing to do. Yeah, of course I've seen that movie, and
I didn't mention any ones that are too bad, did I? I think I avoided most of the bad ones.
I spent a lot of high school in my room with West Coast video cards, so I've had the opportunity to watch every single last one of them.
Oh man. Okay,
But
yeah,
hey,
I did.
now we're here chatting, so it was all worth it, and obviously I'm gonna play this to my parents and be like, I told you.
Fantastic. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Thank
My
you, and
pleasure.
have a good one.
My pleasure. Take care.